In this episode of Flying Through Time, we explore the development of one of the fastest planes ever built. We also trace the history of this aircraft's manufacturer to get an insight of how far we've come in aviation since World War II. But this journey wouldn't be complete if we didn't pay tribute to a brave group of elite aviators who dared to test the untested. They are the test pilots.
Gordon, thank you. Thank you all so very much.
In 1959, the US military awarded North American Aviation a contract to build the Valkyrie. North American beat another aviation giant, Boeing, to this most prestigious project. The project's goals seemed overpowering. North American was to construct the largest aircraft and fastest aircraft ever built. The Valkyrie was to be able to sustain and cruise at Mach 3, which is 3 times the speed of sound and faster than a bullet. It wasn't until nearly 5 years later, on May 11, 1964, that the public saw the Valkyrie. After the press finished their photo shoot and journalists had answers to their questions, the Valkyrie was returned to the workshop to complete its ground tests.
The biggest problem in attaining such speeds as high as Mach 3 is the massive buildup of heat that occurs after Mach 2.5. SR-71, or perhaps better known as a Blackbird, flying at Mach 2.2, heats its outer skin to approximately 527 degrees Fahrenheit. However, this increases to an incredible temperature of nearly 1652 degrees Fahrenheit at Mach 3.2. The XB-70, or Valkyrie, employed a different approach to aerodynamics than the SR-71. The Valkyrie had substantially less drag, and its skin temperature hovered around a much lower, though still very hot, 1157 degrees Fahrenheit during Mach 3 flights.
3 XB-70s were to be built in the original agreement, but only 2 were completed. Each was to be an improved version. The first XB-70 was engineered entirely from wind tunnel tests and computer-generated models. North American didn't expect to get it right first time around, so the second Valkyrie didn't go into production until they had some idea of where Prototype 1 was failing. The history of the Valkyrie really begins with the history of the company that built it, and the progression of technological breakthroughs that North American aviation had already achieved prior to the Valkyrie. North American aviation broke into the defense market in World War II with their now famous Mustang. During 1939, the British approached North American to build P-40s under license. North American suggested they could build a new improved craft using the power plant from the P-40. The British had previously dealt with North American, as they had supplied them with 86 Harvard trainers, and North American had proved their reliability and product quality. Even though North American had never built an actual warbird, the British were convinced that North American aviation would deliver. Overnight, a design team came up with a sleek new fighter plan, and the British gave the go-ahead to proceed with 320 of the new P-51. The contract required the prototype to be ready within 8 months. North American decided to try for 120 days. North American was 2 days late on their estimate because the engines were 2 days late getting to the North American factory. What is most remarkable about this achievement is that the prototype P-51 was built in the same time that it would take for North American to tool up to construct the P-40. North American was a model of technology. The efficiency of the company enabled it to build 9,000 Mustangs in a year. The company went on to produce more planes during World War II than any other American aviation manufacturer. This was a remarkable feat, as the P-51 Mustang was the first combat aircraft that North America had created from the ground up, and is considered as one of the greatest warplanes ever built. The Mustang's military record is outstanding. They destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in air combat and 4,131 on the ground. During the Second World War, the Mustang flew 213,873 missions in Europe alone. The planes shot down by the Mustang add up to almost half that claimed by the combined American units in the European theatre. A total of 2,520 Mustangs were lost. In the late 1950s, North America experienced several setbacks, partly because of its dependence on government business and the cancellation of such contracts. However, in 1960, North American aviation decided to concentrate on space programs, and in 1961, they started work on the Apollo moon landing vehicle contract. They also developed much of the Saturn V launch system.
The Eagle has wings.
In March 1967, North American merged with Rockwell Standard Corporation and became North American Rockwell. With the merger, the company went on to build the space shuttles. North American aviation is an example of how World War II and the Cold War influenced the massive spending that sped up our pace of acquiring advanced technology. During the Second World War, bomber development was mainly in the area of achieving greater payloads, and it became accepted that they would remain slower than fighters. After World War II, and with the commencement of the Cold War, a different thinking was employed, and new bomber and reconnaissance planes were required. On the 1st of May 1965, a strange-shaped plane was rolled out, and for the first time, its shroud of secrecy was lifted. The SR-71 was to be a plane that flew so high and so fast that it could outrun any fighter of the day. Therefore, it could conduct reconnaissance missions without the threat of being shot down. The Valkyrie, on the other hand, was initially designed to be a bomber with the speed of the SR-71. On this day, the plane gained a high public profile as it broke 4 world records, including a speed in excess of 2,000 miles per hour. It was so far ahead of its time that some people believed that humans alone could not build such a craft. No other plane has been the source of such public conjecture. After demonstrating its prowess, the Blackbird was again covered with its shroud of secrecy, and it stayed that way for almost 50 years. Even today, it's hard to get accurate information on the SR-71 project. The physics of compression lift was used to achieve the speed of the Valkyrie. North Americans' engineers revisited NASA's archives for ideas, and they came across a forgotten research paper about compression lift. This paper described how a conical body underneath the center of a wing would push the air to the side, increasing pressure under the wing section. This increases lift with much less drag than simply increasing the size of the wing itself. In this flight, the plane demonstrates the lowering of its wingtips to go supersonic and uses compression lift. The outer wing sections are lowered to 25 degrees for speed from 300 knots to Mach 1.4. For speeds for Mach 1.4 to Mach 3+, the tips are lowered to 65 degrees. Before it flew its maiden flight, the engineers tested as thoroughly as possible every aspect of the plane. Special attention was given to the flight surfaces and moving parts. The landing gear was the most sophisticated arrangement to be used in aviation. This complicated system was used to save space. The bogies rotated about 90 degrees before they were raised into their wells. This complex system proved to be a problem for the Valkyrie. One of the last tests to be conducted was vibration testing. The plane was suspended and hydraulic systems stressed the plane well beyond what it was expected to withstand under flight conditions. While the final tests were being conducted, the test pilots were learning the operation of the 6 engines in a controlled environment. Al White, North American's chief test pilot, was placed in charge of the Valkyrie's maiden flight. Air Force pilot Joe Cotton was the co-pilot. On September the 21st, 1964, the Valkyrie conducted its first flight. At about 8:30 in the morning, the plane was accelerated down the runway and into the sky. This would not be a speed record attempt, merely a short flight to test the basic functions of the plane and let the pilots familiarize themselves with the craft. The first test was to raise the landing gear, and it did not go well.
They are static, is that right? They're not moving? That's correct.
The rear pods didn't fully retract. After a tense few minutes, Al White locked the gear back into the down position. The first test continued with the wheels down. Soon after, an engine warning light came on, and that engine was shut down. Things weren't about to get better. After a 60-minute flight, the plane landed at Edwards Air Force Base. Upon touchdown, a rear brake locked and a fire broke out. Al White and Joe Cotton weren't aware of the problem until the chase plane pilot informed them. When notified of the problem, White let the Valkyrie coast to a stop. He used 10,800 feet of runway. Even with the problems, it was apparent that the plane was going to be fast. It was 2 weeks before a second test flight could be undertaken, as the undercarriage was substantially damaged. On this flight, the undercarriage retracted perfectly, and the crew went on to conduct the flight brief.
Nose gear is up and door locked. Doors are coming closed, and they're closed, and it looks clean now.
During the flight, another problem arose. A warning light indicated a hydraulic problem. Al White immediately lowered the landing gear and headed for Rogers Dry Lake, which provided the crew with an 11-mile-long natural salt runway. As the tests continued for Prototype 1, the building of Prototype 2 began. Already some changes to the original were being made. The most apparent was a 5-degree increase in the dihedral of the wing to improve stability. As the second plane was being built, Prototype 1 continued its tests. In this supersonic test, the aircraft's body flex caused the paint to flake. Unlike a series of later hydraulic problems, this was not life-threatening. This is a short summary of the problems the brave test pilots were to cope with. The 6th flight saw another hydraulic problem which cut the flight short. During the 12th flight and traveling at Mach 2.58, a thump was heard in the cockpit. Engines 3, 4, 5 and 6 had to be shut down immediately, as a small part of the wing had been torn away and sucked into the engines. All 6 engines were destroyed beyond repair. On the 37th flight, hydraulics failed yet again, and both sets of main gear hadn't fully lowered. It was decided to land the plane and hope the bump would lock the gear into its correct position. It worked. The second Valkyrie also had problems. This is prototype 2 on June 8, 1966, about to perform a simple flight plan. It involved a couple of passes over recording instruments at a speed of Mach 1.4. After that, at the request of General Electric, a flight in formation with 4 other GE-powered aircraft was arranged. They were to fly in close configuration for photographers to film publicity pictures from an accompanying Learjet. After 45 minutes, the shoot was finished, and the planes broke formation. Disaster struck. The F-104 collided with the Valkyrie. The complex airflow surrounding the XB-70 lifted the F-104 over its back and spun the starfighter 180 degrees. It collided with both the Valkyrie's vertical stabilizers. It also damaged the left wingtip before falling away in flames. At this point, the F-104 pilot and one of America's greatest test pilots, Joe Walker, was dead. 16 seconds after the impact, the XB-70 started a slight roll and continued through 2 slow rolls. Then the plane went into a spin and the hope of recovery was lost. Al White managed to eject just in time, but his co-pilot, Carl Cross, was lost with the Valkyrie. The chutes of White's pod deployed, however the airbag underneath the pod, which was designed to absorb the shock of impact, had failed to inflate. White's body sustained a 33G shock. Miraculously, although battered and bruised, he didn't suffer 1 broken bone. White was rated flight status 3 months later, but he never flew the XB-70 again. Within a time frame of just 76 seconds, 2 brave and great men and one of the most outstanding planes ever built were gone. The loss of the test pilot and plane is not as unusual as one might think. Many pilots have given their lives while flying untested machines. Finally, on February the 4th, 1969, AV-1 took off for her 82nd and final flight to the Air Force Museum at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Gathering data throughout the entire flight, Fitz Fulton and Emil Sturmthal made a pass over the runway before bringing the XB-70 down for a perfect landing. They handed the logbook to the museum curator, and this act officially ended the XB-70 program. Although he wasn't a test pilot on the Valkyrie project, Bob Hoover was one of North America's most famous test pilots.
Tasmanians are proud of how wonderfully clean and well kept Tasmania is. We have a few
In over 50 years of flying, Bob Hoover has flown in more varied aircraft in more countries and before more spectators than any other pilot in the history of aviation. This is Bob Hoover flying before a small audience in the remote Australian state of Tasmania. According to the Centennial Edition, March 2003, of Air and Space Smithsonian, Bob Hoover was named the 3rd greatest aviator in history. Many other famous aviators describe Bob Hoover as the very best stick and rudder pilot to ever take to the skies. During World War II, Bob's Spitfire was shot down over the Mediterranean. He was captured and spent 16 months as a prisoner of war. He managed to escape and commandeered a German Focke-Wulf 190, which he flew to Holland. Bob has been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, Soldier's Medal for Valor, Air Medal with Clusters, and a Purple Heart. In 1950, Hoover was hired by North American Aviation to do experimental flight testing on many of their aircraft, including the F-100 Super Sabre. When he finished with North American, Bob went on the airshow circuit with a Shriek Commander.
The same techniques are being applied by Bob Hoover in his power energy management series.
Here, Bob is demonstrating his famous routine of flying the Commander through a loop, then continuing with an 8-point roll, and finally landing the aircraft. This is all done with the engines off. Bob keeps the plane in the air for about 3 minutes without power. To a non-aviator, this looks easy. In reality, Bob's routine can only be described as an amazing demonstration of energy management. Bob Hoover, although rated as one of the best, is really only one of many brave pilots that have tested the untested. Unfortunately, many died in the process. Surprisingly, many people may not be aware of the benefits that we enjoy today as a result of the test pilots. Much technology has been gained by our strides in aviation, and much of this has filtered into our day-to-day lives.
Picking it up and rolling it on the other gear. It's not looking good. It's not looking good at all. Both of those propellers are absolutely stationary. Bob Hoover is rolling in towards me, and ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you, as he touches the brake...
That concludes this edition of Flying Through Time. Join us again when we further explore the planes, the people, and the companies that have shaped today's aircraft.
Ladies and gentlemen, is that a piece of flying or what? Ladies and gentlemen, bring him out of the airplane, please, would you? The great Mr. Robert A. Bob Hoover.
Thank you. Thank you all so very much.